This is a reading from Characters of the Reformation by Hilaire Belloc. Chapter 6, St. Thomas More. The portrait of St. Thomas More in any series dealing with the English Reformation must differ in quality from any of the other portraits in this fashion. That is, the portrait of a medium through which we are enabled to understand what the English mind of that day was. In other words, we do not, as in the case of Catherine of Aragon or Henry, Anne Boleyn, Cromwell, or any of the others, concern ourselves particularly with the external events of the man's life. They may be told briefly. They are easily summarized and they are universally known. He was born in the high and wealthy legal world of Catholic England, 13 years before King Henry VIII. He inherited and stepped naturally into the greatest honors and legal position. He abandoned them all and died for the faith. There is no problem of a political nature attached to that famous name. There is no plot or intrigue. We have not to seek out and guess what was really at work in him by way of ambition or anything of that kind. What we can do, and what is of importance, is to understand what the man was interiorly, what kind of victory it was which he won, and how what he was and the victory he won explain the time. The task is all the more necessary because in a very subtle way, but a very important one, the St. Thomas More is badly misunderstood. And through misunderstanding him, we misunderstand the nature of the English Reformation itself, as well as the peculiar and individual greatness of this individual martyr. While I may call the conventional portrait of the man the one which both Catholics and Protestants accept, for he is quite as much admired in the other camp as in ours, is something as follows. While most of England was following the lead of King Henry and cutting itself off from the unity of the Church, and while the country as a whole was going Protestant, a few men among the ladies stood out for the old Catholic position. They would not listen to any talk of a breach with the papacy, which they knew to be of divine institution, and the very keystone of the Church. Therefore they boldly sacrificed themselves rather than give way to the new claims of the lay state, or admit Henry to be the supreme head of the Church, or accept Protestant doctrine, or admit that Anne Boleyn was queen, or that her child Elizabeth could legitimately become queen after her. Of these very few laymen who so stood out, the most distinguished was a great lawyer, a man of good birth, who had early acquired a great position at the bar, and had become Lord Chancellor of England. He was also a great scholar and eminent throughout Europe, but he laid down his life in the cause of the Church as against Protestantism, and on that account as being canonized. That, I say, is roughly the picture presented. Now the true picture tells us things far more profound, and the character it presents is far more subtle, far more tempted, and far more an example of sanctity and martyrdom than so simple a summary would lead us to believe. The external side of this conventional portrait is right enough. Thomas More was a great lawyer who had early achieved fame and fortune in his profession and had become Lord Chancellor of England, was eminent throughout Europe for his scholarship, a great international figure, and was put to death for refusing to deny a point of Catholic doctrine. What is wrong about it is the internal interpretation. Those who thus simplify the story, making it a plain scheme of black and white, do so either because they are insufficiently acquainted with the details of that career, or because the right emphasis is not laid in the right places by those from whom they have drawn their information. Further, the conventional portrait, which I have just sketched, implies a misunderstanding of the spirit abroad at the time of the English Reformation. The whole point of the true story is twofold. One, the great martyr whom we venerate had all the intellectual and moral difficulties which attach to genius of his kind. 2, he acted alone. He was unsupported. As to the first point, he had the temptations which beset the intellectual man, the sensitive scholar, the successful worldly figure. To these temptations he was in danger of yielding, and had partly yielded. He triumphed over them, and that in a fashion quite peculiar to himself. That is why he is so glorious, and that is why he is so great an example. Sir Thomas More was not simply a Catholic withstanding a movement towards Protestantism. Had he been that, he would have been like almost any other Englishman of the time. He was not simply a man determined on defending Catholic doctrine and boldly proclaiming it at all risks, because it was his nature thus to challenge and to combat. Had he been of such a sort, his victory over himself would have been far less than it was. As to the second point, let us note this all-important matter, which is the very core of his great sacrifice. He acted in complete isolation, and he laid down his life for one small, strict point of Catholic doctrine only, and, what is more, a point of doctrine on which he had himself long doubted. He was not supported by the military spirit, the combative energy which delights in challenge and in counter-affirmation. He was not supported by any sympathy for himself, even among his nearest. He was not supported by the nature of his own mind, which had been hesitant and, even in essential matters, changeable. He gave himself up as a victim in spite of all those things, which would make 999 men out of 1,000 deceive themselves that they might be doing right in yielding. This is the heroic and almost unique quality in More. To begin with, let it clearly be understood that St. Thomas More was a reformer. The whole of Europe was in turmoil between the old scholastic culture and the new passion for pagan antiquity, which was making Greek scholarship so powerful an instrument of criticism against ancient ideas and habits and religion. The whole of Christendom was moved also by a spirit which caused the younger men especially, and more especially the more intelligent and emotional of the younger men, to denounce the corruptions of the time, the errors of legend, the exaggeration of certain practices, and the doubtfulness or demonstrable falsity of many shrines and relics. Sir Thomas More was just of the kind who would, according to the mere order of nature, have drifted from step to step, beginning with indignation against abuses, and ending with the full heretical position into which nearly all such men later fell. He was indignant against the social order of his time, as well as against the abuses of the Church. What is more, his indignation inspired him to wit and to very high literary efforts, and men who discover such talents in themselves while they are still young nearly always fall into the temptation of becoming increasingly revolutionary as time proceeds. Sir Thomas More should, therefore, according to the order of nature, have become ultimately a violent opponent not only of the social order, but of that divine unity in the Church for which he laid down his life. All his character seemed to point that way. Again, he began as a man of profoundly worldly ambition. He fully recognized his own talents, and he gloried in them. They had led him to the highest political position in the state. Such a temper should naturally have made him in the long run acquiesce in all official action. Again, he was a man full of humor and also full of domestic affection. He keenly felt how ridiculous a man looks in any isolated position, how absurd it is to be a crank, and he felt still more keenly misunderstandings with any of his own household. Such a man should naturally shrink more than would another from any action, let alone the acceptation of death itself, in which he would suffer the public accusations of eccentricity and perverseness, and the reproaches of his own wife. Lastly, there is this point about the isolation of this martyr. He could foresee no fruit following upon his great example. In fact, during all the 400 years from his day to ours, no apparent political fruit has been borne by it. He was absolutely alone. He had nothing within or without, nothing promised in the future, nothing inherited from the past, nothing in the traditions of his habits and life to nerve him for what he did, and yet he did it. In order to understand how extraordinary the case is, and what a marvelous example it is of resolution and vision combined, let us appreciate exactly what it was that the blessed Thomas More defended at the cost of his life. He died for the principle that ultimately, in spiritual matters, the Pope was the head of Christendom, a principle which all Christendom was debating, and had been debating for more than 100 years, and on which all his lay world in England differed from him. He did not die for the real present, as did many another after him. He did not die as many another might have done, out of loyalty to Queen Catherine. He did not die as a protest against the doctrine generally held heretical. Still less did he die rather than give up some old fixed habit of mind attached to the ancient civilization of his country. He was not a man merely angry against change. On the contrary, he had been all for change. He did not die even at the end of a long public protest against the way in which things were drifting. He did not die for the Mass or for the sanctity of the clerical order. He died only for that one point of the papal supremacy, then universally doubted, and one on which it was common sense to compromise. To us, today, it seems an obvious thing to say, oh, but the papal supremacy is the very test of Catholicism. So Sir Thomas More himself saw, but so did not see, the mass of his contemporaries. And so had he himself not seen a very short time before. When Henry VIII had himself been working against the Lutherans in favor of the papal office and saying that the papacy was of divine institution, Sir Thomas More had been of the opinion that it was not so. He had decided from his reading up to that point that the papacy was no more than an historical development, bound up no doubt with the structure of the church, but of human origin, as is the most of ecclesiastical organization. 100 years before, he would have been essentially, by temperament, one of those naturally supporting the authority of the great councils and thinking them superior to Rome. Yet if it was for that very point, which he had himself doubted, that he consented to die. Observe the circumstances of that death, and see how strange they were compared with what might be called, with due respect, the general run of martyrdoms. The king had determined to get his true marriage declared null, to make Anne Boleyn his queen, and to make Anne Boleyn's child his heir. Sir Thomas More did not protest when he saw that the royal policy was drifting more and more away from unity with the Holy See. He resigned his office, but he did so without explanation. If another should take his place who had not these scruples, he would raise no voice against the newcomer. When the royal supremacy was declared in its final and most conclusive form in November of 1534, and the Pope was repudiated through the Mass, though the Mass and everything else went on as usual, he remained what was called, in the language of the day, a loyal subject to his natural lord, King Henry. He did not challenge, he remained silent so far as official action went, although of course his private conviction was known. Even when the oath of supremacy was administered, he was prepared to accept the marriage of Henry with Anne, and to admit that their child should inherit the throne, through the disinheritance of the true heiress, the Princess Mary. When the document was put before him for his acceptance, to be sworn to in the presence of Cranmer at Lambeth in the Archbishop's palace, he made no protest against it as a whole. All he said was, there was a point in the preamble which he could not accept. He held out over a detail, or what seemed to contemporaries a detail, one poor scruple. He said that the preamble implied something he could not in conscience accept. They did not want to sacrifice him. They bade him think it over, and he walked up and down in the gardens of Lambeth Palace, thinking it over as they thought. But he was not likely to think himself into another state of mind. He stood firm on that one small point, that the phraseology of one small part of law, which in everything else he accepted, was at issue with the orthodoxy. For that he was imprisoned. For that, many months after, he willingly accepted death. When they went through the form of trial in the last days before his sacrifice, it is remarkable to observe how silent he still remained, how wholly upon the defensive, still asking his opponents to prove their case, and keeping back in reserve all that he might have said. Until sentence was delivered, no man could have proved out of his own mouth what that doctrine was, for which nonetheless he was ready to lay down his life. Only when sentence had been passed did he speak at last, fully, and tell them precisely what his position was. To his own family, as a whole, probably to his wife certainly, to nearly all his friends, and to the mass of Englishmen of his time, his position was not heroic, but absurd. The king was already head of everything in England, and had been for generations past. He nominated to the bishoprics and great abbeys. His was the Supreme Court of Appeal in nearly everything that mattered. And even though he was, in this last declaration of full supremacy, something novel, yet a quarrel between king and pope was something with which an Englishman had been familiar over and over again for centuries. It would heal quickly, no doubt, as the others had done before. And at any rate, such political broils were nothing to sacrifice one's fortune for, let alone one's life. If indeed someone must stand out and be dramatic in the matter, and overdo the histrionics in the now quite out-of-date Thomas of Becket fashion, why let it be a priest at least, and best of all some great prelate? No doubt men could understand Bishop Fisher, but why Thomas More? He was, I repeat, utterly alone. He had no support from without. And what support had he from within? That terrible question we cannot answer with certitude, but we can, I think, with probability. I think he had very little support from within. His was not only a skeptical mind, as has been the mind of more than one who has nonetheless suffered death for truth, held by faith and not by experience. It was also a mind which had long practice of seeing both sides of any question, and thinking anything could be argued. On that particular point of the papacy, he had himself argued sincerely enough upon the wrong side. I suggest that the martyr, in his last moments, had all the intellectual frailty of the intellectuals, and that at the end his skepticism was still working, but his glorious resolution stood, and that is the kernel of the affair. He had what is called heroic faith. Could he return to earth today, he would note with that irony of which he was a master, that his sacrifice would seem to have been in vain. Whether it were so or not, only a distant future can tell, but this much is certain, that of all those, and they were many, who bore witness in the 5 generations it took to root out their age-long religion from among the English, his would seem to have been the most complete passion, for he had nothing whatever to uphold him except resolve.